In 1884, Mark Twain published one of the most celebrated novels in American literary history. It won every major award. It was taught in every school. It was called The Foundation of American Literature by Ernest Hemingway himself. And for 140 years, the world accepted it as the definitive story of a boy named Huck and a runaway slave named Jim. Then, in 2024, a 67-year-old novelist sat down and asked one question that nobody in 140 years had thought to ask seriously enough to answer. What if Jim could speak? Not the Jim of Twain's novel, not the shuffling, superstitious, grammatically broken Jim who existed to serve Huck's moral education, but the real Jim, the man underneath the performance, the man who had a name before anyone called him Jim, the man who had been watching, thinking, calculating, surviving in a country that had decided he was not a man at all.
Pause. That question became a novel called James, and what happened next is something American literature has not seen in a generation. James won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. It won the National Book Award for fiction. It became the most borrowed book in the entire New York City public library system. Barack Obama named it one of his favorite books of the year, and it did all of this while being, at its core, a direct argument, calm, devastating, and irrefutable, that one of the most beloved books in the American canon has been telling only half the story for a century and a half. I'm going to take you inside this book today. Every fact, every layer, every reason this novel has become one of the most discussed works of American fiction in the 21st century. Stay with me, because the deeper we go into this book, the more it changes how you see not just Huckleberry Finn, but the entire history of whose stories get to be told and whose get to be watched from the margins. Let me start with the author, because Percival Everett did not come from nowhere. He arrived at this moment through 40 years of work that almost nobody outside literary circles noticed, until suddenly everyone did. Percival Everett was born in 1956 in Fort Gordon, Georgia. He studied at the University of Miami, did graduate work at Brown, and has taught at the University of Southern California for decades. He has published more than 30 novels and short story collections across a career spanning 4 decades. He has been one of the most critically respected writers in America for most of that time, celebrated by other writers, admired by literary critics, and almost completely unknown to the general reading public. That changed in 2022, not because of James, but because of a film. American Fiction, the Academy Award-nominated film directed by Cord Jefferson, was adapted from Everett's 2001 novel, Erasure. The film starred Jeffrey Wright as a black literary novelist, whose serious experimental work is ignored, while a crude, stereotypical novel about black poverty becomes a cultural sensation. American Fiction won the Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay. Jeffrey Wright was nominated for Best Actor. And suddenly, millions of people who had never heard of Percival Everett went looking for the man whose work had inspired it. They found James waiting for them. Now let me tell you what James actually is, because understanding what Everett built requires understanding what he chose to rebuild it from. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn was published in 1884. Mark Twain wrote it as a sequel to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, following young Huck Finn as he fakes his own death to escape an abusive father and floats down the Mississippi River on a raft. His companion on that raft is Jim, an enslaved man who has escaped from his owner, the widow Douglas's sister, Miss Watson, after overhearing that she plans to sell him down the river to New Orleans. Together, Huck and Jim drift through the antebellum American South, encountering con men, feuding families, and the moral rot of a society built on human bondage. The novel is considered a masterpiece of American vernacular writing. Twain's use of dialect, his satirical targeting of Southern society, his portrait of a boy's conscience wrestling with the ethics of a world that has taught him wrong things, all of it represents some of the finest American prose of the 19th century. Ernest Hemingway wrote in 1935 that all modern American literature comes from Huckleberry Finn. That statement has been quoted so many times it has become accepted as fact. But there has always been a problem with Huckleberry Finn, a problem that writers and scholars have raised for decades, and that the literary establishment has spent decades accommodating rather than confronting. Jim, the character of Jim. In Twain's novel, Jim is largely passive. He is superstitious, credulous, and frequently the object of Huck's pranks. He speaks in a thick, phonetically rendered dialect that is designed for the amusement and condescension of a white readership. His entire function in the narrative is to serve as a moral mirror for Huck. His goodness exists to illuminate Huck's developing conscience. He has no interiority of his own that the novel grants him. He is a supporting character in the story of his own liberation. Toni Morrison wrote about this in 1992 in her critical work, Playing in the Dark. She argued that the figure of the African American, the Africanist presence, as she called it, in American literature has always functioned as a backdrop against which white identity is defined and white moral development is staged. Jim in Huckleberry Finn is perhaps the most famous example in the canon of exactly what Morrison was describing. Percival Everett read Morrison. He had read Twain. He had spent 40 years thinking about American literature, American identity, and the stories that get to claim the center of the American experience. And in 2024, he published his answer. James retells Huckleberry Finn from Jim's point of view. But it does far more than that. It does something structurally, philosophically, and politically radical. And it does it with a precision and a calm that makes the radicalism even more devastating. The very first thing Everett establishes is this. Jim has always been able to speak perfectly standard English. He is educated. He has been secretly teaching himself to read. He understands philosophy. There is a recurring thread through the novel in which Jim engages with the work of John Locke, Voltaire, and the philosophical traditions of the Enlightenment, the very traditions that declared all men equal while simultaneously building economies on enslaved labor. Jim knows the contradiction. He has always known it. He performs ignorance because survival in the antebellum South requires it. This is the central mechanism of the novel, and it is staggering in its implications. Everett gives us a Jim who has developed, with other enslaved people, an entire second language, a performance language, a survival language, that they speak in front of white people specifically to manage white people's perceptions and expectations of them. When a white person approaches, Jim and the other enslaved characters shift into the dialect. When they are among themselves, they speak clearly, think sharply, and discuss ideas with the full range of human intelligence. Think about what that does to your memory of Twain's novel. Every scene in which Jim speaks in dialect, every moment that Twain and generations of readers understood as an accurate rendering of Jim's voice, is reframed by Everett as a performance, a mask, an act of survival so deeply practiced it has become second nature. The novel you thought you knew was, all along, showing you the performance rather than the person. Everett does not do this to condemn Twain. He does not position James as a rebuttal or a correction. He positions it as a completion, as the other half of a story that was always only half told. The novel follows roughly the same narrative arc as Huckleberry Finn. Jim escapes, meets Huck, they travel the Mississippi, they encounter the Duke and the King, the con men who appear in Twain's novel. But every scene is filtered now through Jim's consciousness, through his fear, through his calculations, through his awareness that his survival depends on his ability to read white people accurately, to anticipate their needs and their violence, to perform exactly the version of himself that keeps him alive for one more day. One of the most discussed elements of the novel is Everett's treatment of Jim's name. In Twain's novel, Jim is only ever Jim. He has no other name given to him in the text, a common reality for enslaved people in antebellum America, where surnames were denied as part of the systematic erasure of identity and personhood. Everett's novel is titled James, not Jim. James. The full name, the human name, the name that reclaims personhood from the first word of the title. That choice is not an accident. It is the entire argument of the novel announced before the first sentence. Everett also introduces in James a dreamlike narrative thread involving Voltaire. In Jim's interior life, in the moments of solitude and thought that Twain's novel never allowed him, Jim imagines conversations with Voltaire, the French Enlightenment philosopher who wrote Candide, and who was one of the defining voices of a movement that proclaimed universal human reason and universal human rights while existing in a world that enslaved millions. Jim's engagement with Voltaire is not reverent, it is interrogative. He asks Voltaire directly about the contradiction. He forces the Enlightenment to account for itself. These sections of the novel are among its most celebrated, quietly ferocious philosophical exchanges disguised as dream sequences. Now let me give you the facts around the book's reception because they are extraordinary and they tell a story of their own. James was published on March 19, 2024 by Doubleday. It is 303 pages. It was longlisted for the Booker Prize. It won the National Book Award for Fiction in November 2024. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in May 2025. It was named one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2024. It became the most borrowed book in the New York City Public Library system for 2025, ahead of every other title across one of the largest and most diverse reading populations in the world. The audiobook, narrated by Dominic Hoffman, also topped the most borrowed audiobook lists for the same period. The critical reception was close to unanimous. The New York Times called it essential. The Guardian called it a triumph. The novel received starred reviews from Kirkus, Publishers Weekly, and Booklist simultaneously, a rare achievement. And the conversation it generated, on Reddit, on Book Talk, in university classrooms, in literary journals, in mainstream press, has not stopped since the day it was published. But here is the thing about James that I think gets lost in the awards conversation. The awards are real, and they matter. But they are not the most important thing about this book. The most important thing about this book is what it asks the reader to do. It asks you to reread a book you have already read. Not literally, though many people have gone back to Huckleberry Finn after finishing James, and they have described the experience as permanently altered. It asks you to reread the entire tradition of American literature with a different question in your mind. Not who is telling this story, but who is being made to perform for the person telling it, and what is that performance costing them, and what might they be saying when the audience is not watching? That is not a comfortable question. It is not supposed to be. Everett has spent 40 years writing books that are not comfortable. Erasure, the novel that became American fiction, was a savage satire of the publishing industry's appetite for black trauma, performed for white consumption. Telephone, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize in 2020, played structural games with narrative and reader expectation that baffled and challenged in equal measure. The Trees, published in 2021, was a horror novel about racial violence in America that used genre fiction as a delivery mechanism for one of the most direct confrontations with American racism in recent literary history. James is not Everett's most experimental novel. It is, in some ways, his most accessible, which is part of why it reached the audience it did. The bones of the story are familiar. The narrative moves. There is momentum and tension and character. But underneath the accessibility is everything Everett has been building toward for 40 years. The precision of the argument. The refusal to perform anger when cool intelligence is more devastating. The understanding that the most radical act is sometimes simply to insist on full humanity, where the tradition insisted on partial humanity. Percival Everett gave an interview after the Pulitzer was announced in which he said something that has been widely quoted. He said that he did not write James to correct Twain. He said he wrote it because he was curious about what Jim was thinking. That framing, curiosity rather than correction, is itself a kind of mastery. It refuses to position the novel as a grievance. It positions it as an act of imagination, of recovery, of completion. And that refusal to perform grievance in a novel entirely about the cost of performed identity is Everett being Everett. Precise, deliberate, never wasting a single word on a pose. There is one more layer of this book that I want to make sure you understand before we close, because it connects the novel to something much larger than literary history. The question at the center of James, who gets to be the subject of their own story rather than the supporting character in someone else's, is not a question that begins and ends with 19th century American fiction. It is the central question of American culture right now. It is the question underneath the book ban wars, where 40% of the most challenged books in American schools in 2025 were about the experiences of Black people and LGBTQ people. Stories in which communities that have historically been supporting characters in other people's narratives insist on telling their own. It is the question underneath the curriculum debates, the diversity in publishing debates, the streaming representation debates. Who gets to be James and who gets to be Jim? Everett does not answer that question in the abstract. He answers it in the specific, in 303 pages of precise, controlled, devastatingly intelligent fiction that insists, from its title onward, that the answer is not complicated. The answer is that James was always there. He was always thinking. He was always speaking in the language that kept him alive, waiting for someone to write down what he was actually saying. That person turned out to be a 67-year-old novelist from South Carolina who had been waiting 40 years for the right moment to ask the right question, and the answer he wrote won the Pulitzer Prize. Here is what I want you to take from today. James is not a difficult book. It is a demanding one. There is a difference. A difficult book asks you to work hard to follow it. A demanding book asks you to confront something. James asks you to confront the gap between the story you were taught and the story that was happening just off the edge of the page. It asks you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing that one of the books you were told was the foundation of American literature was, all along, only half the foundation. And it does not ask you to feel guilty about that. It asks you to feel curious, to look at the tradition again with new eyes, and to recognize that the stories waiting to be recovered, the stories where the Jim becomes the James, are not corrections to the canon. They are completions of it. Read this book, and then go back and read Huckleberry Finn. Read them in whatever order you choose, but read them together, because together they are something that neither is alone. Together, they are the full story.